I do want to focus a little bit on the environmental impacts of various provisions here, but I want to start by saying that what concerns me to a great deal is the fact that this bill is supposed to be all about creating jobs and generating prosperity, when in fact anybody that's been able to obtain some information from this government, which they're loath to do, releasing information, but any of the experts, the PBO, for example, that's been able to access some information on the impact of the provisions of these bills, of the budget that was brought down last spring, has estimated that, in fact, we're looking at nearly 100,000 jobs lost as a direct result of implementation of this particular bill. And not only that, they're making widespread wholesale changes to environmental protections that exist in various pieces of legislation, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Review Act, the Fisheries Act, the Navigable Waters Act, a number of these pieces of legislation that provide oversight for projects, for developments, for activity throughout this country are being removed, and that's causing considerable concern. I got to tell you that listening to members opposite talk about the bridge over the Detroit River or other projects, I hearken back to, I heard today in the news that the last contract was awarded for the cleanup of the tar ponds in Sydney. Now, the tar ponds is a notable environmental spot that resulted from steelmaking over more than 100 years in Sydney, in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, and government after government after government felt that it was sufficient to make steel, to create jobs, to do whatever you wanted to do with the environment, to get rid of waste, to spoil the earth, to spoil the air, to spoil the water. Rivers were basically completely ruined as a result and covered up as a result of what the steelmaking process did. And what happened was that it took nearly $500 million of taxpayers' money, not the people that actually made off like bandits as a result of the opportunity to make steel in Cape Breton over those 100 and some odd years, Mr. Speaker, but it was the taxpayers that ended up paying as a result of the fact that government after government, both federally and provincially, failed to provide the oversight. And it feels to me like we're going back to the future. We're rolling the clock back in this country. That this government has decided that they want to export oil, that they want to export bitumen, and they're going to see those pipelines built and over as many water courses as needs to happen as quickly as possible without any oversight. And that causes me and members on this side some considerable concern. So not only does the government bring in this omnibus bill, this is part two, which we're going to be forced with one set of votes on. They are in this instance, I understand, rumor has it, they're going to break off some of the provisions of this bill and send them to committee. But we will still be faced with one bill that we will be voting for or against at the end of the day. So, you know, while we're going to, as a result of public pressure, the government is going to engage in greater discussion, allow for greater discussion, I think it's clear that they have no intentions of making any changes to this bill. That's why members on this side continue to move motions to try to get this government to split off some of these important aspects of the bill. But let me get to one issue that is particularly burdensome and troublesome with what this bill is doing, and that is the change to the Navigable Water Protection Act, or in fact the removal of the Navigable Water Protection Act. Mr. Speaker, Canada has over 32,000 lakes and rivers, and under this proposed budget bill, only 97 lakes and 62 rivers are identified as significant. Now, why is that important? I heard a member opposite get up a moment ago and say that the changes made to this act were important for farmers and so they could plow over ditches in their field. Well, it doesn't have anything to do with ditches. That was the first budget bill. That was last spring when they allowed that to happen, when they allowed developers and others to get the plows out or the bulldozers out and plow over the ditches. This has to do with lakes and rivers, Mr. Speaker, lakes and rivers. Let me give you an example. It's going to leave thousands of waterways without protection. They're even walking away from the majority of Canada's 37 designated Canadian heritage rivers. Now, Mr. Speaker, that means that a couple of rivers, heritage rivers in Nova Scotia, one of them being the Margaree, which is part of the Margaree Lake Ainslie River system, where Atlantic salmon and trout flourish, an incredibly pristine water course. That's going to allow potentially roads or bridges or other projects to interfere in this particular river, in this particular watershed, without the requirement of permitting. Same thing for the Shelburne. The Shelburne River, Mr. Speaker, begins in the Tobiatic Wilderness Park. It's part of the Mersey River system. It's an important river system for the Mi'kmaq. It's been used for millennia, and now it's no longer under protection. The government doesn't seem to understand how important these rivers, how important these lakes, how important the environment is to Canadians. And that's what our job is here on this side, is to make those points and to bring that information to the attention of Canadians. And as I indicated to you earlier, we're going to do that by continuing to move motions to try to split off various portions of this bill, so not only do they get proper debate, but they get an opportunity to have a vote. Now, Mr. Speaker, my time is nearly over. I want to move a motion. Mr. Speaker, I would like to seek unanimous consent to move the following motion: that notwithstanding any standing order or usual practice of the House, clauses 173 to 178 related to changes in the Fisheries Act be removed from Bill C-45, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 29, 2012, and other measures, and do compose Bill C-47. That Bill C-47 be entitled an act to amend the Fisheries Act and the Jobs, Growth and Long-Term Prosperity Act. That Bill C-47 be deemed read a first time and be printed. That the order for second reading of the said bill provide for the referral to the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. That Bill C-45 retain the status on the order paper that it had prior to the adoption of this order. That Bill C-45 be reprinted as amended, and that the law clerk and parliamentary council be authorized to make any technical changes or corrections as may be necessary to give effect to this motion. Mr. Speaker, I am proposing this motion as indicated so that we will have the opportunity not only to discuss the changes that are being proposed and debate them and to hear witnesses, but we will have an opportunity to vote on these specific amendments and I therefore move and request said unanimous consent.
Does the member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour have the unanimous consent of the House to propose the motion? No, there is no consent. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for Dartmouth Cole Harbour for drawing attention to the seemingly inexplicable choices of what rivers are now covered by the Navigable Waters Protection Act, now to be renamed the Navigation Protection Act, and what ones are abandoned. Clearly, something on the order of 98 to 99% of all the internal waterways of Canada are now to see a full-on retreat from federal constitutional authority that cannot be, the provinces can't step up and fill the void because of constitutional law. Only the federal government is responsible for navigation on waterways in this country, and yet the members of the Conservative Party who speak in this House say, don't worry, Canadian common law will still apply to protect navigation, which means that if someone wants to protect their rights to use the waterways, they have to go to court. What does the honourable member think of that?
Honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Well, I thank the member for the question, and again, I find it appalling what this government is proposing to do with respect to these important watercourses and waterways. You know, I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of organizations. I was in Alberta just this weekend, where I had the opportunity to talk with an organization that's concerned about watershed that they're responsible for. In particular, the Bow River will be covered under this particular act, but the Old Man River won't. And the two are completely interconnected, Mr. Speaker. So people are saying to themselves, what's the rationale behind this? And more importantly, what is the damage going to be as a result of this legislation and the removal of oversight and protection?
Questions and comments? The honourable member for New Westminster Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his comments. I think he's really highlighted a number of issues key to the BIA. My question is on employment, and he referenced this obviously is a major issue. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has stated that this budget will cost 43,000 Canadians their jobs, and that the budget actually plans for unemployment to rise. And if you combine that with the previous rounds of cuts, the PBO projects a total of 102,000 jobs lost. I'm wondering if my colleague could comment on this.
The honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Well, thank you. I thank my colleague for his question. And provisions of this bill are particularly onerous for the reasons that he cited. In terms of the actual direct jobs that are going to be lost. The other part of the bill that really puts it to workers, and whether you call a worker a private sector worker or a public sector worker, they're a worker that's supporting families, supporting communities, and making a contribution to the economy of this country. Well, this government, as a result of changes to the pension plans for public sector workers, Mr. Speaker, are in effect rolling back wages, because pensions are nothing but foregone wages. It's exactly what they are. They're freely negotiated, and there's trade-offs made during negotiations. Pensions part of the compensation package. What this government is doing, and they're asking us to do, is unilaterally impose a rollback in the area of 25 to 30% on public sector workers in this country.
Questions and comments? Questions and commentaires? L'honorable député de Hochelaga.
The honourable member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives say that they've consulted on this budget bill, but if the Conservatives had consulted First Nations, for instance, in Mi'kmaq, in my colleague's writing, do you think they would have been in agreement with the changes to the navigable waters, for instance? The honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
That's an absolutely perfect question, because I've talked with the officials at the Atlantic Policy Congress, the First Nations chiefs, the traditional governance structure for the Mi'kmaq and the Atlantic provinces, and there has not been any consultation. Likewise, I spoke to the Thames River Watershed Conservation Society on Thursday of last week. They're responsible for 410 kilometers of watershed as a volunteer organization, and they have not been consulted, Mr. Speaker. I spoke to Trout Unlimited on Friday in Alberta. They had not been consulted about the changes to this Act that directly affect their area of interest, and in the case of the Aboriginal community, that directly affects their treaty and Aboriginal rights.